effective documentation practice. Getting it right. So as an overview, good technical documentation is the result of purposeful and encompassing design and creation. It just doesn't happen spontaneously. Standardization is one key component of effective documentation practice. In other words, if you work at a company, you want everyone to do their technical documentation the same way. There are a lot of reasons for this, but one obvious one is usability. If people are used to documents looking the same way, being organized in the same manner, then they will much more easily understand and utilize this documentation. It's also important to note that standardization is often driven by external auditing agencies like ISO. The ISO is an international organization for standards. Many companies locally and across the country are ISO certified. Therefore, their documentation standards must meet the standards set forth for them by the ISO agency. So that's something that's important to note and something that often drives standardization practices in business. A review of documentation ensures that the purpose of the document is met given the target audience. So in other words, it's important to make sure everything is standardized, but you also want to keep in mind that the purpose of the documentation is met and that standardization practices don't take away from that purpose. So some basic criteria relative to standardization. Your documentation should be accurate, it should be clear, it should be concise, it should be coherent. It should also be appropriate. It should be driven by audience analysis and the stated purpose of documentation. To do all these things, it's important to establish a protocol for documentation practices. In other words, here are the way we're going to create documents, here's how our documents will look, here's how they will be revised, so that everyone has a very good understanding of what documentation should look like and the documentation's purpose and who the audience is for any specific documentation. So one of the first things, or the first thing that you want to do, is gather information. So when you do that, you want to create an outline for document content. It's important, once again, to standardize document formatting because that helps you with your outline. You can also use the standard format currently used by your company. So generally speaking, if you come to a new company, they will already have formatting, or they should have formatting, relative to how their documents are standardized. Once again, external agencies often drive the standardization practice. When you write documentation, you always want to write a first draft of the documentation. Take that documentation to the end users, to people who are interested parties, to subject matter experts, and make sure that the documentation not only meets the document standardization, but also so that it will be usable for the audience that is intended for. When we talk about revision, it's always a good idea to revise your documentation in a systematic way. So not only is our documentation standardized, but the means that which we produce the documentation is standardized as well. You want to revise for organization. You also want to revise for accuracy and audience considerations. So relative to something like work instructions, the accuracy is driven by audience considerations. In other words, I take my documentation out to the floor. I have people see that if they can build what they need to build with my instructions, and I'm utilizing the audience to actually drive the accuracy of my documentation. You want to edit for clarity, coherence, and conciseness. And of course, you want to proofread for grammar, punctuation, mechanics, and usage. The clearer your language, the more easily understood it is. The document should also record revision history. Once again, external agencies almost always require that you have a revision history on any of your documentation. One other thing to think about relative to documentation is it culturally sensitive? Your elements of documentation should meet needs and expectations of various cultures. Oftentimes, the documentation we create will be disseminated across the country or even across the world. People in Europe, people in Asia, and people in North America all have cultural differences, and your documentation needs to reflect that. Colors and images, for example, have various cultural context, and you need to be sensitive to the context that these colors and images evoke. Language, formatting, graphics also need to comply with various cultural needs and expectations. So to review, multiple reviews are recommended before publishing. Reviews should include members of your target audience. In some cases, legal reviews may be necessary to avoid liability. So depending on the sensitive nature of the documentation that you're producing, particularly if it's proprietary information, you may have to get a legal team involved. You should keep in mind that updates are often necessary with technical documentation. Once again, a revision history is required.